Hello everyone and welcome on board to RGV Aerial Photography Starbase Flyover Review Episode 5. This is Mauricio, your photographer and guide for today. We'll be covering updates at SpaceX Starbase facilities, cruising at an altitude of 10,500 feet. These photos were taken on June 21st and with some additional ground shots. We have overflights starting at the Massey's test site, Sanchez, and the build site, with our final destination being the launch site. So fasten your seatbelts and enjoy the flight. Firstly, let's take a look at the Massey's test site, where SpaceX structurally tests articles. Comparing the first flyover taken on June 14th, and here's the second photo of Massey's taken on June 21st, with quite a few notable changes. As always, feel free to scrub back and forth the video to see more of the differences between these photos. Starting off our tour Massey's, let's first take a look at the pad which SpaceX is preparing to test boosters' ability to hold cryogenic liquids under pressure. This week, we noticed that the concrete pouring has been entirely completed. Looking slightly down the image, the framework for the booster quick disconnect or BQD has now been mounted on the notched area of the concrete pad we talked about in the previous episode. This will be used to support the booster QD unit as it fuels the booster during cryogenic testing. We also see that pipework from the tank farm has progressed even further towards the booster QD. Another thing we notice is that all the dirt has been backfilled around the edge of the booster cryo station pad in preparation for rolling boosters out to Massey's for testing. Now let's move further down and take a look at where the ship puck shucking stand used to be located. We now see a 9-meter circular steel honeycomb-shaped structure in its place. Last week, we speculated that it may be a dedicated puck shucking stand for the boosters. Our theory was proven right this week, as the honeycomb structure has since grown into what looks to be the start of a booster puck shucking structure, fit with attachment points for thrust rams for hydraulic testing of the 13 Center Raptor engines. These rams will push onto the thrust puck of the booster while it's held down by the clamps, simulating the effect of in-flight thrust loads on the engine mounts of the inner 13 engines. If you're wondering where the ship puck shucker was moved, look no further. It's now located on the ship cryo station pad here. This probably means we can expect to see one of the completed ships sitting around at the build site move to this crowd testing station soon. Moving to the left to the former structural test article, nose cone 31, we see that it has finally been dismounted off the top of the nose cone cage stand last week. As it stands, the cage used for testing nose cone 31 is currently too short and configured for use only with nose cones without their payload bays attached. The nose cone cage itself will likely be reconfigured soon to allow for testing the structural integrity of nose cones stacked on the payload bay. We can expect it to be stacked onto the bottom half of the nose cone cage, which has been staged next to the top half, indicating the nose cone cage will once again be stacked to full height. And if you're wondering where nose cone 31 went this week, its remains were spotted here, following its scrapping after its structural test to failure. Now moving past S26 in the can crusher, where we saw pipework being rerouted to, we take a look at the cryogenic tank farm where SpaceX has prepared 2 new concrete pedestals to host 3 new horizontal liquid nitrogen tanks. Surprisingly, we saw this week that SpaceX managed to fit not 2, but 3 of the horizontal tanks from KSC on these pedestals. Now that they have been mounted on these new pedestals, the next step will be connecting these tanks to the tank farm using all necessary pipework and other equipment. In our last stop at Massey's, we swing over to the right to look at the top. This week, we noticed some equipment and machinery has been moved from the staging area to this area, which used to be occupied by the 3 horizontal liquid nitrogen tanks from KSC before they were moved to the tank farm. Now moving on to the Sanchez site. Here is the first photo of the Sanchez site taken on Wednesday, June 14th. And here's the second photo taken on Wednesday, June 21st. As always, if you like more comparison time on these photos, feel free to scrub back and forth to see more of the differences. SpaceX started groundwork for a new building on the far end of Sanchez. At this point, it seems we can expect that this will become the new home for the ground fabrication building. The steel just to the right serves as confirmation of the fact, as we know this is steel from the ground fabrication building as it gets relocated from the build site to make way for the Star Factory expansion. Moving east, the transport stand intended for transporting boosters has been fitted with alignment pins, and we can expect Booster 12 to use this stand for transportation around Starbase. Looking to the right, we see that protective canopies have been installed over the nozzles entering into the water-cooled steel plates, with large holes cut into the tops of them. These plates will be installed underneath the orbital launch mount to prevent concrete from being thrown up like we saw occur during IF-21. Here's a render by the space engineer showing this newly revealed feature of the steel plates. We're currently unsure of the purpose of these holes, so let us know what you think in the comment section. Furthermore, the blue colored tarps covering some of them have also been removed, a promising sign that SpaceX is getting ready to transport them to the launch site. Sitting just above, 3 more sections for the new Mega Bay 2 have been assembled. These will be used for level 3 of Mega Bay 2. We can also see 2 more assembly jigs here currently sitting vacant, and we can expect construction of the rest of the level 3 segments to commence shortly. Before entering the inventory tent, the first thing we notice is the new booster thrust puck has been delivered, and is to be used on booster 18 or above. We also noticed a second welding turntable has been delivered near the inventory tent. We expect this and the white wrap turntable across the road to be installed in Mega Bay 2 once that's been fully constructed. Additionally, we've also noticed the outer skin and insulation has been removed from the Remedios Avenue end of the inventory tent. This will either be to install a big rolling shutter door, or which seems more likely to us, to create a large exit to be able to remove the steel plates being worked on in that tent, which right now is impossible due to the relatively small exits the tent currently has. Lastly, as seen in this ground video from a few weeks ago, SpaceX was busy constructing a retainer wall around the green patch of grass that SpaceX doesn't currently own, just to the south of the inventory tent. Moving on to the scrapyard, the first and the most interesting thing we've noticed is the pilings that were installed in the ground here in March of this year are now being exposed again, likely for a piling cap to be created for whatever is due to be installed on that section of the ground. Next, we notice this crane in the process of being connected to the BN2 test tank, now converted into a water tank, which means it may be getting moved soon. Our last stop on the tour of Sanchez will be the Rocket Garden, where we can find Booster 10, Booster 4, SN15, Ship 27, Ship 20, and Ship 26 is still mounted onto the engine installation stand opposite the Rocket Garden. It has been mounted on its stand for a considerable amount of time now, with all of its engines installed, and this week, we saw the ship transport stand staged next to S-26 as well. This could possibly be a sign that S-26 is coming off the engine installation stand soon to be transported elsewhere. As for Booster 10 and Ship 27, they are likely being stored in the Rocket Garden until space is available for them at either Massey's or the launch site to undergo their testing campaigns. Another notable thing we noticed here last week is a new booster holding pad in an early stage of construction situated to the left of Booster 10. We also noticed conduit running right through the middle of this pad as well. But as of June 21st, the holding pad has since been poured with concrete. We can see that the 12 embeds necessary for a booster stand have been placed, confirming our theory that it is indeed for boosters. And with that, we conclude our tour of Sanchez, where we've seen a multitude of changes take place since the last flyover. Next up, we'll be taking a look at the build site. Departing Sanchez, we move slightly northeast to the 47-acre build site where SpaceX constructs Starship and Super Heavy. Here are 4-second shots comparing the first flyover of the build site from June 14th. Here's another 4 seconds for the photo from June 21st to compare the changes. In our first stop at the build site, we take a look at the future Mega Bay 2 under construction. As of June 17th, we saw the stacking of all 4 level 2 corner sections after level 1 finished last week. We can expect the corner section of level 3 to be stacked fairly quickly after this, due to there being a backlog of level 3 sections waiting to be stacked at the Sanchez site, with one of them already being staged next to the second Mega Bay, seen here. Meanwhile, additional cladding has been installed onto the level 1 sections. As expected, the LR 11000 crawler crane used for stacking the second level and above has taken the place of the LR 1300 in the middle of the Mega Bay 2. And looking to the top right, we can see 2 new ship forward flaps right next to these 2 unusually spoked half-ring sections whose purpose is currently unknown. All this talk about segments and levels can be so confusing, so here's a render by Lolomatico 3D on Twitter to help us visualize just how fast SpaceX has been constructing Mega Bay 2. Moving on to its older sibling Mega Bay 1, the first thing we see is Booster 12 liquid oxygen tank has grown considerably since our last look at it. As seen in this ground photo taken on June 16th, the partially stacked LOX tank is in front of Booster 11 ahead of stacking. That aforementioned section remaining to be stacked is the last section of B12's methane tank, seen here. As of June 22nd, there is just one more stack remaining before Booster 12 is fully topped out. It's taken 17 days for SpaceX to get Booster 12 to this point, and the rate of construction is truly remarkable. Next, Booster 11 is hiding at the back of the Mega Bay 1, still being worked on, and slightly over from that we see Booster 9 is also being prepared. Booster 9 is due to be used for the next integrated test flight, but because the OLM and the orbital pad is still being worked on, Booster 9 is currently unable to do any further testing. Right next to the Mega Base, it's a high bay, where we see Ship 28 under construction. It's been moving around inside recently, with the most likely reason being to create better access for workers to install the second nav flap on this ship, which occurred on the 22nd of June. It could also be to make space for the removal of its payload bay door, which was uninstalled for unknown reasons. Or maybe it just feels a little restless waiting to launch, which is understandable. On the left, we see a fully stacked Ship 29 sitting in the back of this bay being worked on. The 2-point ship lifter system we saw installed last month is also no longer connected to the ship. It'll be a while yet until Ship 29 is ready for any kind of testing. Next, we take a look inside the mid-bay, where the speculated Crew Starship mock-up is being worked on. On the previous flyover, we observed black paint was applied on the edge of the heat shield to square off the edges. This week, we saw no more obvious exterior work being done to the mock-up, as it's likely most of the work is being done in the interior. Moving outside the mid-bay from left to right, we see the newer 20-hold single-ring sleeved over-and-E dome, an untiled ship payload bay without its payload bay door, and a 1.5 ring skirt taken off of S26.1. Why are these particular sections staged outside the mid-bay? And do we expect the S22 nose cone and speculated Crew Starship mock-up to be stacked on top of these? If it is stacked onto the payload bay, here's a render of what it might look like, courtesy of the space engineer. We theorize that this could potentially be the reason behind the decision to move the second half of the nose cone structural test cage at Massey's next to the first half, ahead of its potential stacking and testing of the new nose cone. Looking up towards Highway 4, the 3-phase power line expansion has progressed, with the trench meant for housing power lines now reaching the B2 entrance to the build site. We now see most of the trenching has been completely filled again, with concrete poured over the tops of the trenches, indicating that this section of the power line expansion is likely complete. In front of the mid-bay is a ring yard, where SpaceX stages rings before stacking or scrapping. Just like the previous 2 years of flyovers, we notice there's still a multitude of various ship and booster sections sitting in this area, including the nose cone for Ship 30, which we expect to see moved into the high bay for stacking of Ship 30, an upside-down comet dome section for a future booster, and we notice a single ring with lots of unusual cutouts is on the left with the word scrap written on it. This ring was first spotted by LabPadres rover cam last month and was speculated to be windows or an inner stage to allow for abort capabilities. Sadly, it seems like it's now going to be scrap metal. Now let's move over to Phase 2 of the Star Factory expansion. The first section of framework for this phase is now fully erected and is waiting to be covered with insulation and cladding. On the right, we see more roofing sections sitting on the floor waiting to be lifted on the vertical pillars. We also now see footings for more of the Phase 2 Star Factory expansion heading towards Highway 4 in the area where the low bay and the pipework assembly building used to reside, but were demolished recently. We also see a new conduit running parallel to all these new footings as well, which will serve as a housing for electrical wiring for the factory expansion. Seen from a better angle on the flyover from June 14th, we also notice an outline cut into the concrete extending all the way down to Highway 4, revealing the massive scale of Star Factory's future expansion. This shows that the next phase alone will be truly massive, and if it eventually covers the tents as well, the total area would be approximately 720,000 square feet. This excellent depiction by Thomas shows just how large the Star Factory will become once fully constructed. This is just the first step as SpaceX seeks to increase the rate of Starship production by several orders of magnitude, which is absolutely a prerequisite for the ultimate goal of a colony on the Moon or Mars. And thanks to the space engineer for making this render. There's no such thing as too many Star Factory renders to help illustrate the massive scale of the factory of the future. And lastly, we'll take a look at the crane yard. The only major thing we notice here is the 2 arms for the new 2-point ship lifter system. There is still some hardware missing from the setup, but once the remaining parts have been delivered and arms fully assembled, we can probably be sure that this is bound for the launch site to be used to lift the ships on and off the suborbital test stands using the 2 upper load points on the ships. This should greatly reduce the hassle that workers go through, rather than having to wait right up until the ship gets removed from its test stand for the last time ready for launch to remove the 6 lifting eyes and tow over the lifting points left behind. SpaceX can instead use the 2-point ship lifting jig while the ship is being stacked at the build site and can tow over the 6 lifting points before the ship moves out for testing and launch. This 2-point lifting system grabs onto the 2 load points under the ship forward flaps, which don't need tying over like the 6 lifting points on the nose cone. This system was first tested on Ship 28 back in April. And that concludes our tour of the build site. Up next, our final stop, the launch site. Now approaching the launch site, first purchased by SpaceX in 2014 to launch Falcon Heavy rockets. Since then, the site has undergone drastic changes as SpaceX readies it to support regular launches of the giant Starship Super Heavy rocket. As SpaceX rapidly proceeds with upgrading the launch site, we at RGV aim to give you an overview of the many changes each and every week. Here are 4-second shots comparing the first flyover of the launch site from June 14th. Here's another 4 seconds of the photo from June 21st to compare the changes. Starting off our tour of the launch site, our first stop is at the suborbital pads. Thanks to the incredible timing of our flyover on June 21st, we can actually see Ship 25 being fueled up in preparation for its spin prime test, which occurred the same day. This is following an aborted attempt which occurred on the 14th, which ended in no spin prime test for an unknown reason. Here we see the tweet from SpaceX confirming the success of the test. In case you're wondering what a spin prime even is, it's a test that involves the same steps as a static fire, with only difference being that the engines don't actually ignite. This test involves loading methane and liquid oxygen into the ship, then spinning up the engine's turbines and flowing the propellants through their respective turbines. This will be the spin part of the test, and no thrust is produced when the turbines of the engines are spun up, unlike a static fire test that involves ignition of the engines and thrust being produced. Next up is the middle of the launch site. The first thing we see is that the new pilings that have been installed in the area are now being exposed again, ahead of pile caps being formed on them. It looks like there will be quite a large amount of weight placed on all these pilings, as we speculate that they may be used as foundations for additional horizontal crowd storage tanks. This fantastic animation by our team member Jake gives us a sense of just how many new hot dog tanks could potentially be added as a replacement for the vertical nitrogen and LOX tanks. Swinging further up, we see that these staircase sections, which we believe will be mounted externally on one of the back faces of the orbital launch tower. The base of the future staircase can be seen here, although we'll talk more about the launch tower later on. Now let's talk about all the hardware installed at the back of the launch site that will be used to feed water into the water-cooled steel plates at a very high pressure. First, we see that the new pile of high-pressure gas cylinders has grown even more. It's still unclear where all these will actually be installed, but it's likely they'll be used with the water-cooled steel plate system. Taking a look at the high-pressure gas cylinders, we see the 2 already installed stacks are now feeding into multiple manifolds on the ground. We see the pads split off through 2 sets of valves on the last manifold. The larger valves will supply gas to the bigger water supply tanks, and the smaller valves will supply gas to the 4 smaller water supply tanks. As seen in this fantastic render by the space engineer, we can better see how these manifolds attach to the fronts of the gas cylinder stacks, then connecting to the white manifolds laying on the ground next to the gas cylinder stacks. And then those white manifolds then connecting to the white manifold installed on the tops of the 4 water supply tanks. Moving further left, we see that 2 90-degree bend pipes have been installed here. We speculate that this extreme angle likely means they will act as gas traps, controlling and regulating the flow of water from the tanks to the water-cooled steel plates. One of the advantages of this design is that it reduces the water hammer effect, which is a high-pressure shockwave that results from water moving under high pressure being forced to stop suddenly. Looking further up the image, we see these large sections of pipework have been staged over the past week. ahead of their installation in the ground beneath the orbital launch mount. It seems like these have been staged closer to the OLM as SpaceX anticipates their installation date to be coming up soon, and we can look forward to that in the coming weeks. Speaking of the orbital launch mount, let's take a look at the location where we've seen the most change, as SpaceX prepares the launch pad for a second orbital test flight. We can see the power rebar under the OLM has grown considerably since past weeks. Using Pythagorean theorem, after approximating the length of the ladder and taking into account its angle, we were able to estimate a thickness of 2 to 2.6 meters for the height of the rebar. If you're wondering what all this rebar will be used for, it's intended to help reinforce the concrete piling cap that we can expect to be poured under the OLM fairly soon. The massive water-cooled steel plates will be mounted on top of this piling cap, which has to be large enough to support the foundations and weights of the massive steel plates. As seen here, this is where the rebar ties into the tops of the pilings underneath, which SpaceX has been working for the past 2 months to dig and fill with caissons and then concrete. Looking at this new render courtesy of Chrome Kiwi, we can see where these pilings are located under the OLM. We also see here that the cryogenic supply pipework sections that were removed a while ago are now once again being reinstalled in this area, and are still located in their previous positions. This strongly indicates that none of the pipework and manifolds for the steel plates exceed the area past where the cryo supply pipes are located. Moving up to the actual orbital launch mount, we notice that some of the flexi cryo hoses have been reinstalled onto the booster quick disconnect, along with some additional insulation covering these hoses now. Looking at the interface of the launch ring, we now see black covers over the ends of the booster hold-down clamp arms. These clamps may now have been reinstalled and are currently being protected by all these black covers, similar to how the red covers protect the Raptor QDs. Next, we move over to the launch tower. The only noteworthy detail we see is that the ship QD unit is still missing off the ship QD arm. We still don't know for sure why this was removed, but there's a good chance upgrades are being made to this unit for future launches. And we also see another shot of the new staircase tower installed at the back of the tower connecting to the base. Moving over to the orbital tank farm, our final stop in the tour Starbase. The first thing we notice is that the pipework that was being worked on in front of the tank farm has now been moved into the area behind the methane subcoolers, where they are now being assembled and joined with the larger methane heat exchanger. Finally, most of the dents have been pulled out of one of the water tank cryo shells and has had external bracing added to the outside of it. And that's it for episode 5 of Starbase Flyover Review. Thank you for choosing to fly with RGV aerial photography, and I really hope you enjoyed this flight. Support our flyovers through Patreon to keep us flying every single week. All support goes towards covering the expenses of the flights. If you like what you saw today, please subscribe for more episodes and content so you don't miss out on the new videos each week. And also leave a thumbs up. I'd like to give a special shout out to the RGV team members Jake, Gosh, Peekaboo, Procky, Straw, the Space Engineer, and Starbase Walker. I'm Mauricio, and I'll see you next week from 10,500 feet. That's all for now.